Welcome to another episode of the Your Longevity Blueprint podcast. Today, my guest is Lara Adler, who's an environmental toxins expert and educator and a certified holistic health coach who teaches health professionals of all types and individuals with health-based businesses to better understand the role of environmental chemical exposure in causing or contributing to chronic health issues so they can more comprehensively support the clients and patients they serve. She trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposure so they can improve client outcomes without spending hundreds of hours researching on their own. Combining environmental health education and business consulting, she's helped thousands of health professionals in over 35 countries around the world elevate their skill set, get better results for their clients, and become sought-out leaders in the growing environmental health and detoxification field. I'm excited to chat with you. Welcome to the show, Lara.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to dig in.
So tell us your story. I ask all my guests their story, right? How did you become an expert in this field specifically? I'm sure there's a story behind that.
Yeah, it's funny because I know a lot of people that kind of roll into the practitioner or health wellness space in general tend to get there because they had their own health challenge that they had to figure out, and then they were like, oh wow, oh my God, I had no idea, and I'm obsessed with this topic. And like I actually did not have that story. I did not have like any toxic exposure. I just didn't have anything like that. So I don't have
Lucky
that
you.
cutesy, kismet story. I don't have quite that story. I was always interested in health and nutrition and food. Primarily, that was sort of my gateway into this space. Just even as a young kid, even in high school, middle school, I was like vegetarian and like learning about food and how to cook. And that is the thing actually that opened the door for me into this space. I pursued a whole different focus in college, and I spent 7 years in a totally different industry after college, and I really felt like I wanted to do work that contributed in a more meaningful way to the world, than the corporate job that I had sitting in a cubicle in Midtown Manhattan, like wasn't it for me. And so, I'd always been a nerd in the food and wellness side. And so I said, oh, let me see what's out there. I discovered health coaching, and I thought, oh, hey, this might be an opportunity to kind of do my own thing, be my own boss, and then flex my muscle around this nutrition stuff that I love. And so I did that. And I went back to school and I got a certification and started seeing clients. And really, it was through my client work that I kind of stumbled into this environmental health space. Asterisk small print, there's actually more to the story. It's actually pretty interesting. But I stumbled into the space because I had clients that were coming to me for weight loss, and they had done everything that I'd recommended. They were like super compliant, which is like not that common. And it wasn't budging for them. And I was really frustrated. I was a new health coach. I was trying to, really bring it for these folks. And so I started digging into the literature around like resistant weight loss and looking for, what's under all these stones that maybe I haven't uncovered. And that's really where I stumbled into this field of environmental health, environmental medicine. I was living in New York City at the time with, the Mount Sinai Children's Environmental Health Center and the New York Academy of Sciences. And so it was just immersed myself in this academic world of this discussion and talking to epidemiologists and epigeneticists, and just my brain was like so lit up on this topic. And so I spent a couple of years really digging into the literature because it was so fascinating to me. And, it was really clear from this research that environmental exposures, just even through living our normal everyday lives, are really meaningful in terms of their contribution to chronic health issues. And this was 15 years ago. So like no one was talking about this.
Right.
And so I was like, well, but this feels really obvious that we should be talking about it. And so in 2012, after a couple of years of really just making sure I understood what this space was all about, started teaching. And I have been doing that ever since, nonstop. So we're in year 11 now of doing this work, and it's been really rewarding. And so that asterisk small print, funny story, that kind of came full circle for me was two things. One, my dad, who's 86, will be 86 years old this year, still working, has worked as an independent consultant for 20 odd years for PFAS manufacturers.
Dun, dun,
Manufacturers of
dun.
nonstick coating, manufacturers of manufacturers of nonstick coatings. And so, like, I know a lot about the coatings because I grew up with a dad who worked from home and I was the little office secretary. And so, like, I learned a lot about that just sort of through osmosis. And I remember being in college, like in my sophomore year in college, reading about Teflon toxicosis, which is what happens when you use Teflon pans or nonstick pans, and you have birds in the house, and birds have incredibly sensitive respiratory systems and they would drop dead. And I remember sending these articles to my dad. This would have been in like 1997 or 8 that I was doing this and sending these articles to him. And I didn't know it at the time. He was forwarding them to the president of the company and just like, hey, FYI. And then about 6 years ago, I went back to Connecticut where I grew up, was in when you go back to your parents' old house in your old bedroom and you look at all the like stuff that you didn't deem worthy enough to take with you when you moved on to your adult life, it still lives there. So I found a plastic box of index cards from a paper I wrote on vegetarianism in high school, because it was the bibliography, right? Like, this was in the early 90s. This is how we did bibliographies then. And so I randomly pulled out an index card, and it was just a quote from some book. And it said, paraphrasing, something about, people turning more towards vegetarian diets, in part because of the toxic chemicals in agriculture. And I was like, and so this was like, there's some part of me that has been magnetized to this topic. And I just remembered, like, that blew my mind. I sat there on my little twin-size bed in my bedroom looking at this index card going, that was 23 years ago at the time. I was like, that was a long time ago. So I stumbled into this on accident, but I don't know, maybe I didn't. That's the story.
And part of me wonders, like, as a nation, how far have we come since then? Because part of me thinks we really haven't come that far. You've come far, and you've been educating clinicians, but I feel like we haven't come that far. So but that is super interesting story. I want to ask, maybe let's just start from the beginning for our listeners and kind of break down what environmental toxins are. You've mentioned one of them, right? But what are they and how do they affect us? And then maybe we can break down specifics, but just in general, what are environmental toxins?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to kind of contextualize this conversation because, even you just throw out the word toxic or toxic chemicals and people kind of get little spooked by that sometimes. And so, environmental chemicals are just chemicals in our environment. Environmental toxins are chemicals that are known to be or are suspected to have some implications, negative ones typically, on human health, animal health, wildlife health, and just the environment in general. And these are, globally, there's 350,000 chemicals and chemical mixtures that are registered for use. The vast majority of those didn't exist 100 years ago. So, like, the landscape of just the planet is really different. And, when we're talking about toxicity, I think there's a really big misconception that when people hear toxic chemical or toxic chemical exposure, they automatically are thinking, oh, this is something that's going to cause an acute reaction, nausea, vomiting, hair loss, skin reactions. It requires a trip to the emergency room or a phone call to poison control. And while those type of exposures certainly can happen, in our day-to-day lives, that's not actually what's happening. We're getting really tiny, tiny exposures to toxic chemicals every single day from dozens and dozens of places in a single day. And that over the course of our lifetime or over the course of many years, or certainly even in really critical windows of development, say fetal development, those little exposures can actually be really impactful and they add up. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about these small exposures that, if everything else is equal and we never had another exposure and we just had this one from this one plastic product or this one, scented candle, no big deal.
We could handle it, right?
Yeah, no big deal. right? It's the totality of what we are exposed to that tends to overburden our system and that compromise our health in really significant ways. That's still being figured out, right? We're still learning about so many of these chemicals. So those 350,000 chemicals I mentioned, most of those have never been adequately assessed or reviewed for safety. In fact, we don't even know.
Especially in combination with each other. Yeah.
Yes, and especially in combination. So like, not only do we not know much about the properties of many of these chemicals, some of them are deemed confidential. So confidential business information, there's CBI claims. And so companies don't have to tell you. They're like, well, it's proprietary. I don't have to tell you. And our federal policies allow that. And so there's just a lot of opacity, both on we don't even know what's out there. There's opacity in terms of manufacturers not being legally required to disclose chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of their products.
It's
So
just crazy. That just
yeah.
doesn't make sense to me, but it is what
Yes.
it is, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about these really small, seemingly insignificant exposures that we get from, our drinking water or our shampoo or our deodorant or the sunscreen we put on. Like there's the plastic Starbucks to go container, like whatever, all of the sort of materials that we interact with. I do think it's important to, when we're talking about toxic chemicals or chemicals in general, another sort of common reaction that people have is like, oh, well, like everything is a chemical, which is true. Everything is a chemical. And so what we're talking about in conversations like this are not all chemicals. We're just talking about ones that we do know or strongly suggest or suspect that are causing some health issues. And so really that's where the microscope is focused. Certainly not all chemicals are bad. Many chemicals have made our lives better, easier, longer, safer. And so we don't want to kind of tar them all with the same brush, which often happens in this conversation.
Sure. When you're talking about the accumulation of all these little pieces of exposure, can you, in short, for the audience, kind of explain what that adds up to from a health standpoint?
Yeah. So, I mean, the answer to questions like that is almost always going to be, it depends, right? There's so many ways in which there's no tissue in the body, there's no organ system in the body that's not affected by some type of toxic exposure. So every organ system, every tissue can be affected. And so the endpoints, meaning the results, is everything from like, eczema and, a dermatitis, right? Contact dermatitis or something like that, to Alzheimer's, to Parkinson's, to dementia, to cancer. To other neurodegenerative diseases,
infertility,
infertility, developmental disorders, like birth defects, cancer, like the list is enormous. Heart disease, obesity, insulin resistance, all of it, right? And so the endpoints the list is vast. It's kind of everything. The challenge is that we can identify through, for example, animal studies, hey, we can start looking at like mechanism of action, meaning this chemical seems to act on this pathway, and in animal studies, it's showing this results. Well, we don't test chemicals on people as a general rule. There have been historical incidences of people doing that, not advised. And yet, so we have animal studies, and then we'll look at human epidemiological data and say, hey, are we seeing the same trends that we saw in these animal studies for populations that have higher levels of these toxic chemicals? In a lot of cases, the answer is yes. And that's the strength of the science that we have to navigate, right? It's not a perfect, I think a lot of people, I'm going to rephrase that. People in industry are the ones that really demand absolute proof in the harm that environmental chemicals cause or chemicals cause. And my glib response to that is absolute proofs only exist in mathematics, not in science, right? So we don't have proofs in science, we have evidence in science. And the evidence all resoundingly points to the fact that a lot of these environmental exposures are in fact causing or contributing in some way or associated in some way to this wave of chronic health issues that people are experiencing. And so the endpoints are everything. right? The endpoints are all serious and even non-serious health issues, right? Headaches,
Sure.
brain fog. So the list is
Yeah.
long.
Yep, I figured. One endpoint I do want to focus on, because I mentioned before we started recording, is that I have a hormone clinic, and we know that one endpoint is
Yeah.
hormone disruption. So can you explain how chemicals are linked to hormonal issues, aka endocrine disruption, and then maybe we'll break down some of those specific endocrine disrupting chemicals?
Yeah, so there's lots. So chemicals tend to be grouped when we're looking at health effects into a little bit of that rough category of that mechanism of action. Are they carcinogens? Are they neurotoxic? Are they reproductive toxins? Are they endocrine disruptors, meaning they can disrupt our hormonal system?
Sure.
The frustrating thing is that many chemicals can actually do all of those things. Right. So they can be a carcinogen because of endocrine action. They can be a reproductive toxin because of endocrine action. Right. So like there's I think in Venn diagrams, and so the Venn diagrams of these categories overlapping for certain chemicals is really strong. So some chemicals might be endocrine disrupting, but so far we don't have data suggesting that they're a carcinogen. Or they might be indirectly feeding that, right? And so we have these different broad categories. Endocrine disruption is one. And so, the Endocrine Society, which is the world's largest society that, is for all things endocrine health, they define endocrine disruption as any exogenous chemical. Exogenous just means from outside. Chemical or mixture of chemicals that can interfere with any aspect of hormone action. So any aspect whatsoever. And so what happens is there's lots of different ways that they can do this, right? That they can mess with our hormones. One of the ways is through what's essentially referred to as like a biomimicry, meaning you have a chemical molecule of estradiol or estrogen or whatever, right? Estradiol is just one of the estrogens. And so our body is designed to respond already innately to these really small amounts of hormones that course through our bloodstream. Like that is what they do. And we have receptors for each hormone. So there's hormone receptors for testosterone, there's some for estrogen. And so it's like a lock and key. And the key is unique to that lock, right? So those things fit together. The problem is when we have endocrine disrupting chemicals, these exogenous chemicals that look almost identical from a molecular standpoint, the shape of the key is the same, right? It's close enough that it will still open the lock. And so many of the chemicals that we interact with in our daily lives can be an endocrine disruptor through this pathway. There's other pathways, there's a lot of other ways that they can do this, but this mimicry is pretty common. So for example, BPA. BPA was actually developed in 1891, right? It's been around for a long time. And it was actually a contender for pharmaceutical use as a synthetic estrogen. It wasn't strong enough. The chemical that beat BPA out was diethylstilbestrol, which if you know anything about fertility and pregnancy,
birth defects.
Causes birth defects. Uterine and testicular and all kinds of cancers in the offspring of the women who took it during a specific trimester of their pregnancy. And so we were like, oops, that's bad. Let's take that off the market, right? So BPA was actually designed originally as a synthetic estrogen. It just wasn't quite strong enough for the things that they were trying to use it for. So it kind of fell into the shadows. And then in the early 30s, I think 30s and 40s, maybe even the 50s, it found its place in plastic. So like Bakelite plastic, which was one of those first like, wow, this is such a marvel. It's not metal, it's not a natural material, but wow, it's so durable. Bakelite plastic was made with bisphenols, bisphenol A. And so there's this long history with this chemical that the molecule is so close to the estradiol molecule that our bodies can't really tell the difference. And I think where endocrine disruption is so concerning when it comes to the type of low-level chronic exposures that we get, not just from BPA. There's about 1,400 chemicals that have been identified as being endocrine disrupting so far.
Wow.
There's a lot. And we might be exposed to a dozen of those easily in a single day without doing anything, different from our normal everyday lives. And so the problem here is, as I said earlier, a lot of these products and the exposures that we're getting are really small. They're tiny. They're almost meaningless on their own, right? And so this is the argument that the chemical industry and product manufacturers say, oh, it's only, this fraction of a whatever, nanogram or whatever per dose. Okay, great. That would be fine if this product and this exposure was the only one that I got every day. It's not. There's multiples. What we know about endocrine disrupting chemicals, you mentioned earlier, like we don't know how they react. Chemicals react inside our bodies together. It's really hard to study that. This research that has been done on what's referred to as the cocktail effect, meaning when you're mixing endocrine disruptors, is that specifically with endocrine disruption, the effect of the exposure can be additive, meaning 1 + 1 = 2. It also can be amplified, right? So 1 + 1 might equal 4 or 5. So it's greater than the sum of its parts, and that's concerning. So the main reason why all of this is concerning is our body, our human physiology, all physiology, mammalian physiology, is designed to respond, react, to function using these infinitesimally low levels of natural hormones in the bodies. We're talking parts per trillion, right? Fractions and just the tiniest amounts that you can measure. And we know how profound those natural fluctuating hormonal changes can be. Be around a kid going through puberty and you'll know that, right? Be in menopause and you'll know that, right? These are profound changes. There's all these unwanted side effects and mood alterations and temperature alterations and weight alterations that happen with these teeny tiny fluctuations. And so our body is actually designed to respond to those tiny levels. And so when we get similarly tiny levels at parts per trillion, which is what's happening through these consumer products, we are actually being exposed at the frequency that our physiology is designed to listen to, right? Designed to hear. And that's where these things are so problematic. So in the field of toxicology, the famous adage is the dose makes the poison, which is like anything can be toxic. It's just the dose that makes it so, right? That's the paraphrasing the Paracelsus quote. And so, yes, and, right? The dose makes the poison, meaning a high exposure to something is worse than a low exposure. So like radiation, a lot of radiation, very bad, deadly, right? A little bit of radiation, no big deal. We can handle that, right? And so the assumption in toxicology is that nearly all things follow that model, that more is worse and less is okay, or at least the effect is lower, and that there's a certain point where like there's no effect. And so endocrine disruption has really blown apart that concept, because it's actually not true. In a lot of instances, the lower exposure is going to have a more profound effect or outcome than a high exposure. And part of that can be explained by that hormone receptor analogy. We don't have finite hormone receptors, right? And so once all of those are filled, so to speak, like more isn't going to do more hormonal stuff.
Right.
The locks are all filled with keys. And so there might be other effects, right? And so this is where the animal research that we have, like I said, that, most of these chemicals in commerce haven't been tested. The ones that have been tested aren't being tested for chronic low dose exposures. They're being tested for these high exposures. We're going, okay, so you have to eat, 16 gallons of, cereal to get enough glyphosate to cause a quote adverse health effect. Great. Well, but what happens if I have a little bit of that every single day, all day for the rest of my life, or for 10 years or 20 years? Is that also being studied in toxicology? No.
I want to, as I'm just sitting here thinking, oh, I was going to put some chapstick on, this is
So
just
you're like, actually, wait.
I'm just thinking, you have me thinking of my accumulation of exposure. I don't drink out of plastic, and I'm sure that'll be one of your tips, but I mean, and I don't know, sorry, Burt's Bees, but you were on my desk today. I love this stuff. It's just Burt's
Okay.
Bees lip shimmer. It's just like a tinted chapstick sort of thing.
Yeah.
But do you think, I mean, even, plastic, this is in plastic, right? That I'm putting on my lips several times a day. I mean, is there a chance that that plastic is leaching into this lip gloss that I'm applying, right? Is that one of my exposures, which I don't even know if there's BPA in this plastic. Maybe there's
Right.
BPA free, who knows? But I just, for the audience, am trying to give them an example of layer upon layer upon layer of potential exposure
Yeah.
through just your activities of daily living that we're not thinking, are contributing to our
Sure. I mean,
toxic burden.
Yeah, I mean, first, if we just get back to the lip gloss and the plastic packaging, but like, think about your daily morning routine. You wake up, you brush your teeth. What is in that toothpaste? Is it sodium lauryl sulfate? Is there fluoride? Are there other antibacterial agents in there? Maybe. Okay, great. Now you go take a shower. You have shampoo that has fragrances, that has preservatives, that have, allergenic chemicals in there. Then you have your conditioner. Maybe you have face wash. Then you have a body wash. Then you have,
Shaving cream, maybe if you're
shaving
male.
cream.
Yeah,
Then
yeah.
you get out. It's deodorant.
Deodorant.
It's hair product. It's all your makeup and body lotion. And that's before you have even left the bathroom.
Your home.
The bathroom, right? Then you go and make breakfast. You pull out your nonstick pan. You've got your, kids eating off of plastic plates and cups because you don't want them to break stuff because they're toddlers and they're going to throw it, whatever, right? And so, and then you go, you sit on your couch has flame retardants, your couch has PFAS chemicals, if it's got a stain resistant treatment, like we are living in this toxic soup and there's literally like, okay, polar bears, and then this is sort of the doom and gloom part. Like we'll get to there's stuff that we can do part.
I want to dive into the doom and gloom though, because I want to make a strong case. So keep going. It's okay.
Polar bears in the Arctic have flame retardant chemicals in their bodies.
How is that even possible? From the water?
Because flame retardants,
jet rocket fuel or something?
No, they are very persistent in the environment, meaning they don't break down easily. That's not true for all chemicals. Some chemicals are not persistent, but flame retardants happen to be persistent. And then they travel through wind currents. They travel through ocean currents. They don't degrade. And so they stay intact. They, just through ocean current and wind currents, they travel up or down to the poles. And so we have, polar bears in the Arctic that have their body fat has high levels of these chemicals because a lot of these chemicals, including a lot of the persistent ones, are fat soluble. That means they accumulate and build up in our adipose tissue. And polar bears have a ton of fat. Same thing with whales have toxic chemicals in their body. The higher an animal is on the food chain, I'm talking swordfish, shark, these apex predator species have a ton of contaminants in their tissues because of careless human activity, corporate greed, name all the things, right? And so we're now left in this place in time where we are scrambling to try to clean up the messes made of past generations and the messes that continue to be made right now. I mean, we've had oil spills and train derailments. I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but with the Ohio train derailment, because the soil in the train derailment area had dioxins in them, because when you burn plastics.
Let's go there next to dioxins, but yes, go ahead.
And so that they scooped up all that soil, put them on the back of a train to go haul it somewhere, don't know where. The train crashed, dumped all the soil. It's like, we can't make this stuff up. It's just I'd say it's a comedy of errors, but this is the darkest comedy ever. Like, no one is laughing, we're all crying.
It is depressing. Okay, tell us about dioxins. So
yeah. I mean, dioxins are endocrine disrupting. They're also one of the most potent carcinogens known to man. They are not a chemical that are produced. They are a byproduct of incineration for the most part. And so that is really industrial factories and burning. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, and particularly just recently, there have been new sort of sustainable waste factories that have been approved, where they are have been given a green light under the sort of green umbrella of like, this is sustainable and good for the planet, of essentially these are incineration factories, and the amount of dioxins that are going to be produced from the burning of plastics like has environmental groups up in arms, because they're like, first of all, how dare you call this green, and second of all, like, this is dangerous. Dioxins are so persistent, and they are there's no safe level of exposure to dioxins. And like I said, they are very endocrine disrupting and they are very carcinogenic. Because of their persistence, they can be found in adipose tissue and fat products. So things like butter and cheese and milk, in particular butter and cheese, because they're concentrated fat,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And so
do they even off-gas off like printer paper? Or what is it
sure.
that's on? I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. What comes off like printer paper or like even receipts? For a while they said, oh, don't take your receipt from your restaurant.
All
What's
different things.
All different.
Yeah, so the thermal paper, so the receipt, that's BPA. So if you take a regular piece of paper and thermal paper and you close your eyes and you feel them, the thermal paper feels powdery, feels slippery.
Yep.
The reason is because it literally just has a powdery coating of free bisphenol chemicals. So at least in plastic containers, whether it's a lip gloss container or your food processor blender or your Starbucks to-go cup, that BPA is at least somewhat bound up in the matrix of the plastic. It's not fully bound, that's why it migrates out. But with cash register receipts, it's literally just rubbing off on your fingers. And we have unfortunately, very good dermal absorption. Like, we absorb a lot of things through our fingers. And so there have been studies looking at dermal absorption rates of handling thermal paper, including shift work for cashiers. Right. So it's not just us as we're like going grocery shopping. My bigger concern is, the person whose job it is to check receipts at Costco. That's all they do all day is touch receipts. All day, right?
What do they do? Wear gloves? What can they do?
They should wear gloves. Yes. That's the recommendation, is like, if that's their job, you can't not do the job. That's the job.
Give them gloves, please.
Wear nitrile gloves, wear something that's going to be a barrier.
So what about, you made me think about disposing plastic, because we've talked a lot about getting rid of plastic in your kitchen and switching to glass, whatnot.
Yep.
How do you properly dispose of plastic? Do you put that in?
There is no proper way to dispose. I mean, look, you can try to recycle, but the recycling rate in the United States is abysmal. Some of that is intentional, not intentionally doing a bad job, but industries and manufacturers intentionally either making it hard or making it the recycling process misleading. So for example, you stop somebody on the street and you turn over a plastic bottle and you say, what is this symbol with these 3 chasing arrows? And they're going to go, oh, that's going to tell you it's recyclable. That is not what that means at all.
What does it mean?
So the name of that little symbol with the number is a resin identification code. It's an RIC. And so the resin identification code does not say this plastic is recyclable. It just says, oh, this type of plastic is a polyethylene terephthalate versus a high density polyethylene versus propylene, polypropylene versus the other category, right? So it just kind of slots plastics into general types that can help with recycling. So people can go, oh, a number 1 plastic, PET plastic, that is a plastic that you can recycle. There are no recycling facilities anywhere that can recycle number 6, which is polystyrene or styrofoam. There is no plastic recycling center that can recycle polycarbonate plastic. So
what's Tupperware? Because that's what most people are going to be getting rid of in their kitchen. Yeah,
they can be different, right? So it depends on the brand. Like Rubbermaid makes some that are polycarbonate, that's other. That's the type of plastic that's more likely to have BPA. So polyethylene terephthalate, like your Poland Spring water bottle, never had BPA. This is where I get so frustrated because I'll see articles about BPA and then they show PET plastic bottles as the graphic. And I'm like,
And
no,
you're like,
that's
mismatch. Yeah.
confusing. That's not
Yeah,
the type of plastic that has bisphenols. That type of plastic has other chemicals, just not that one, right? And so, there is no such thing as a totally safe plastic. Some are better than others. I kind of look at things on a spectrum of good, better, best. And so, in terms of minimizing the plastic use in our homes, my big priority is minimizing plastic where it comes in contact with food and water, period. That's the primary objective. We are never going to be a plastic-free society. I'm sitting at my desk. I'm like, oh, this picture frame behind me has plastic instead of glass. My ring light is made of plastic. My, controls for my sit stand desk are made of plastic. The chair I'm sitting in is plastic.
My pen is plastic. Everything. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, look, plastic can also save lives, right? I am not a Luddite. I am also not anti-plastic. I'm just anti-plastic in the way that we interact with plastic here on Earth, right? And so think about a bike helmet. Great, a bike helmet or a motorcycle helmet, plastic. It's going to save someone's life. NICU babies in a plastic incubator with life-saving IV bags and tubing made of plastic that are concerning, that have chemicals in them, and they're life-saving. So we have to have balance and perspective in this conversation. What I don't want people to feel is like, oh my God, I can't even touch it because plastic, it's toxic, don't touch it. That's not what we're talking about. We still have to live on this earth. We have to just navigate our lives. I drive a car, there's toxins in my car. I'm not gonna like, have a horse and buggy and, go move to an Amish village. The Amish, incidentally, at least one study has found that they do actually have lower levels. It's a very small study, but they do have lower levels of a lot of these chemicals because they don't
I believe it.
use
a
lot of these products. They don't have no levels. They have less.
Lower. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I could talk to you forever. Let's go to I don't know how to pronounce it. If PFAS and PFOS are the same thing, but can we go there? Because I actually have a friend whose water has been contaminated with this, which is, I believe, also an endocrine disruptor. She lives near an airport. It's in the water, I think, from the airport. Maybe you can put that together, but is that common? What do you know about this? Have you heard of this? How dangerous is it?
So PFAS stands for per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. It is just a class. It's not a chemical. In fact, there are estimated to be over 10,000 chemicals in this class, the majority of which we don't know anything about. Period. It's a black hole.
How?
Because of there's depending on which country you live in. There's no, like in the United States, we don't have any. I mean, this is a global problem, right? 99% of people in the United States already have these chemicals in their blood. It's already a problem. We can't put the cap back in the bottle, right? We can slow it. Anyway, so PFAS is this enormous class. They're used in hundreds of thousands of places, applications, both in industrial manufacturing, consumer manufacturing, military, in medicine. They're used in millions of places. And so this enormous class doesn't, they're not all identical chemicals, but they seem to share a lot of the same properties. So the fluoro, the perfluoral alkyl substances, the fluoro in there indicates the presence of fluorine. Fluorine is an element. It is a halogen on the periodic table of elements. So is chlorine, bromine, and iodine. Iodine is essential for healthy thyroid function. It's a Goldilocks element. Too much is not good. Too little is not good. And so, unfortunately, when you have chemicals on the periodic table, they share similar properties. That's why they're grouped together. And so, chlorine, fluorine, and bromine, and chemicals that are made with fluorine, chlorine, and bromine, including fluorinated chemicals, chlorinated chemicals, and brominated chemicals, all have the capacity to displace iodine in the thyroid. They push out iodine, and so they are directly linked to a lot of thyroid issues, unsurprisingly. And so that is something to be concerned with. And this is why the entire class of chemicals is concerning. So the chemical industry will often say, oh, well, these very toxic chemicals, PFOA, PFOS, these are just two chemicals in this enormous family. Well, those ones were terrible. Those ones have been phased out of use. We don't use those anymore. We use all these other ones, but these other ones are totally safe. And it's like, well, you can't say that because it's a fluorinated compound, and we already know that fluorine, because of how it interacts with, for example, even just thyroid hormone, like that's a problem. And so the class of chemicals is enormous. They're found in, like I said, hundreds of consumer products. They are used, they're incredibly persistent. And persistent just means that they don't break down, or they don't break down easily at all, which is why we have polar bears in the Arctic that have these chemicals, just like flame retardants. They're very persistent. And so they build up in our bodies, and we have them in our tissues, in breast milk, in serum, in adipose tissue, like they're just in our bodies. And we're exposed to them constantly. So your friend who lives near a airport, you said?
Yep.
So airports and military bases and areas surrounding those tend to be the most polluted. Also industrial areas where they're being manufactured, or they're being used in manufacturing, tend to be the areas that are most polluted. And the reason why airports and military bases in particular tend to be polluted is because the firefighting foam that they use for, whether it's a drill on putting out a fire or there's an actual fire, those foams contain PFAS in large quantities. And so though they spray them on the tarmac, they spray them on the field, whatever, because they're they're doing a drill and they got to teach people how to put out a fire. And so they're using these fluorinated firefighting foams, and then those chemicals they get into the groundwater, get into the drinking water. And for so we have our national, the Safe Drinking Water Act, passed in the 1970s. This was our, one of our very early environmental regulations, laws in this country was like, hey, we need to regulate chemicals in the water. Great, that's a good idea, right? And so currently there's about 89 chemicals that are regulated. Just because a chemical is regulated does not mean that it is not present in the water, because water utilities are constantly in violation of federal law on limits of toxic chemicals. For the first time since 1996, since I was a freshman in college, right? For the first time since 1996, there's been a proposal to add 6 individual PFAS chemicals to the Safe Drinking Water list of regulated contaminants. It's not even passed, it's just a proposal. I'm sure it will pass, but this is the first time we've added new chemicals to this list since 1996. So like, we're not doing a great job.
Right.
And the levels of these chemicals, these PFAS chemicals, is so low, it's basically zero. The safe level is basically zero, and it is the lowest threshold for any chemical on their registry. Why? Because they're so strong in their endocrine disrupting capacity that those small amounts are still showing harm.
So she cannot drink the water near her house. I mean, that's very clear.
She should filter her water.
Yes. Well, so I don't even, I guess that's my question is, can she filter her water? Can this be filtered out with an appropriate?
Yes. PFAS are actually not extremely hard to remove from the drinking water. What is required at a minimum is a multi-stage activated carbon filter. So it has to be a multi-stage. So single stage filters like a Brita filter, not going to touch it at all. There needs to be a larger volume. So if you think of those like under sink canisters where you install a water filtration sink, it just needs to have multiple filters, and at least one of those needs to be activated carbon. Those are really good at taking out PFAS. A reverse osmosis system will take out all PFAS.
Good to know. Very good to know.
So
I feel like we should stay on the topic of water for a second here, because I did
Sure.
put, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, when I built my house, I put reverse osmosis in the house because I knew enough at that point. But then I thought, oh gosh, that's taking out the minerals. So now I got to replete the minerals. But that was only for my drinking water. It wasn't,
Yes.
so the RO was for
And
the
you
drinking
wouldn't
water.
do it, you would never do reverse osmosis for your whole
For
house.
shower.
It's so wasteful.
Sure, sure.
So
But
your
she would
water
still
bill
be
would be-
showering in water that has, PFAS, however we say that.
Yes, yes.
My son, the city I live in notoriously has very high chlorine levels, which, like, as you were saying, can displace iodine as well. But bottom line is,
Yes.
once I had a son, I'm bathing him, bending down to, bathe him, and I'm just inhaling this chlorine. And I'm thinking, this is
Yes.
disgusting. I had no idea, because I honestly don't take a lot of baths. I do showers, obviously same water, but in that moment, I knew I had to put a whole house filtration system.
Yes.
And so I put in a charcoal filtration
Yes.
system.
Yep.
It sounds like she could do the same thing, but all this to be said, question that a lot of my patients ask, which I don't always have the answer to, is what do they need to be thinking about with purchasing water filters? Because a lot of people just get the Brita. And I say, I know
Right.
that that's not sufficient, but I don't know why. So I think I heard you said has to have one layer of carbon and it has to have multiple layers.
So that's just for PFAS.
Okay. In
So-
general, what should a consumer look for with
Yeah,
water
so-
filtration?
It's actually really hard for me to answer that question because and I actually have a 3-hour course on water contamination and filtration.
Wow,
Because
cool.
it's not a simple question to answer, right? If it was, you could go to my website and be like, here, buy this. This is the quote unquote best filter, which is what people are experiencing online. Influencers or
Yeah.
whatever accounts being like, oh my God, this is the best filter, go out and buy it. Here's the problem with that. Everybody's water contamination profile is different.
It's different.
I might have arsenic. That's really hard to remove. You might have your city might not use chlorine. I mean, if you can smell it, it is.
It's in there. It was
Some
high,
cities use chlorine and ammonia. And so that requires a different treatment because it's harder to remove. You might live in an agricultural area where there's more pesticides. Somebody else might live in an industrial area where there's more industrial chemicals. Somebody might have lead pipes in their house, somebody else might not. And so there's so many different variables. Then there's also the variable of cost. How much money do people have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not only factoring in the cost of the filter and replacement filters, but your water bill. So like the reverse osmosis, for every gallon of water that you drink, it can take between 3 to 5 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon. So there's
Never
waste
knew that.
happening.
Yeah.
And so this is why you would never put it in a whole house system,
Sure.
because that means every time you
Too
flush the
wasteful.
toilet,
Yeah.
you're just wasting water. I live in the desert, so water waste is not cool. Anyway, then there's also cost and budget. How much can people afford? A whole house system at a minimum is going to run, $1,000 to $1,500 and upwards. Not everybody can afford that. I remember when I lived in New York City, I had like a 600 square foot 1-bedroom apartment. I had 24 inches of counter space in my kitchen. I had a tiny kitchen. I also had, I couldn't open the oven door without opening the fridge door first. A lot of people live like that.
Yeah.
And people at the time, I remember telling me, oh, you need to get a Berkey water filter. I'm like, where the hell am I going to put a Berkey?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a countertop. I'm not sacrificing my limited counter space.
So I've seen those big silver,
Yes,
Berkey. What's the
Berkey.
deal with the Berkey? Why are they so popular? What is it that it's?
They're popular because social media influencers love to sell them. That's why.
Okay.
They have all kinds of problems. I don't generally recommend them. The problem is people are saying, influencers, whatever, people who are selling filters, this is the best filter. Oh my God, my water tastes so good. I love it. Okay, great. Well, taste is not an indicator of whether or not there's not toxic chemicals in there. A lot of chemicals don't have a taste. So taste is not, that's a completely subjective, first of all. Second of all, it is not an indicator of how contaminant free your water is. Second, they are taking the claims that the filter companies are making at face value, when the water filter industry it's the Wild West out there. People are making all kinds of claims that I'm like, there's no way your filter takes that out, because I know the media in your filter and that media doesn't adequately remove that chemical. So it's complicated, right? So the thing that I recommend, I don't recommend people go out and buy a filter. I recommend that they actually test their water first.
Yep.
Yeah. So and there's a company called TapScore that I recommend. They have really great testing, and they will actually
Score,
tap,
HEP,
like a
oh,
tap,
like a tap.
yeah,
Got it.
tap
Tap
score.
score. Okay.
And they will actually, based on your results, give you an unbiased and unaffiliated recommendation and say, hey, here's a couple filter companies that we know that, you know, should be able to take these chemicals out. You decide what you want to do, but at least now you have more information to say, okay, here are these chemicals in my water. 3 of them are at levels that are concerning. I'm going to prioritize filtering those
for
ones
these.
out.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Wise
what
approach.
happens?
Yep.
Yeah. So what happens is people go to the store, they go to, you know, to Costco or what, Target or wherever their shop, Home Depot, and they're like, oh, here's a water filter. Look at the long list of chemical names that it says it takes out. That's impressive. I'll buy this one because this list is really long. It says it takes out 300 chemicals. Amazing. Look, I'm so dazzled. I don't know what any of these chemicals are, but like, wowee. Except if you don't know that maybe your water has arsenic, and that's an incredibly toxic chemical that you absolutely want to pull out of your water. And it's also not easy to get out. You need specialized filters to do that. You're just going to look at this list of all these chemicals that maybe you don't even have in your water. And then the one that you want to remove is not on the list.
Yeah.
And then you've just wasted, you know, $100 or $300 on a filter, and you have this false sense of confidence that your water is great. And so we have to be informed. It's the one area that, like, I mean, I've been doing this, like I said, for 11 years. I have probably been asked what's the best water filter. And I'm like, the best water filter is the one that takes out the contaminants that you have. And I don't know what those are. And I also don't know what you can afford. And I don't know how much room you have in your house. And I don't know if you're a renter or do you own your home.
Right.
Lots
Sometimes
of variables.
I found that out with some patients who I found some things based on testing. I said, you really need to be filtering your water. And they said, well, based on my lease, I had a 3-year lease with this home, they were not allowed to put in any sort of, you know, large unit, which was interesting. But I will put that tap score in the show notes because that's super interesting.
It's just it's a really good resource.
Thank you.
You know, it's not free, right? It's going to be a couple $100 to test the water.
But it's worth it. Yeah.
But I think if people can afford to do that, I think it's worth it. If they can't afford to do it, it's not great information, but it's some information. If they're in the United States, they can Google water quality report, and then their city and state every year. Your water municipality is legally required to produce this report. They don't always do it. So you might not find the current year, you might find, you know, last year or the year before. And it will give you some information about those regulated contaminants that they're legally required to test for. But it's not a full picture because there's hundreds and hundreds of chemicals in the water that are legally allowed to be there because there's no regulation saying that they can't be there. And
does any water filter out like birth control pills and hormones, medication, that sort of stuff?
Reverse osmosis will do that.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll take out, reverse osmosis will take out the most contaminants of any system. It's not without its downsides. We should really be remineralizing the water because that will strip all beneficial minerals out. That's easy to do. And so, you know, that is an option for people, but like, I will also want to caveat that, like, don't just go get at an RO system if you don't need it, because it's so overkill for most situations. And unless you have a chemical that can only be removed by RO, it's just wasteful and unnecessary. Well, I did it because I didn't know, but my question is, it's already in my house. But I've thought, though, many times downstairs, I'm looking at that system and I'm thinking, great, this is filtering my water, but yet it's connected to a tube, a plastic tube, which isn't taking my water up to the kitchen. And I'm thinking, what's in that plastic tube? Am now getting plastics in my water? Yeah. And how often does that tube need to be changed out? And, you know, I'm thinking again in layers of my I think, and I get that question a lot too. And I think that, you know, one, we have to, and this is really hard to do. And this is why I do education for practitioners is because they're going to get these questions.
Right.
And it's just like in, medicine, we have to learn to triage, is how I refer to it. Like, which things are in fact a 4-alarm fire and which things are like, look, in the grand scheme of things, that's not as big of a deal as this. Or sometimes it's, look, I can't control that exposure, so I am going to just try to let it go and not be stressed about it, because certainly stress contributes to chronic disease as well, and that's not helpful. And so there is like this a wave of people's emotion as they learn about this, right? In the beginning, it's very overwhelming. And then the more information they get, that overwhelm starts to spike. And then more information later, if they have the ability to triage, the overwhelm actually goes down. Like, I'm not somebody who stresses. I know a lot about this topic. And sometimes I jokingly say, I know too much to like live comfortably in this world. Because I mean, the real joke, and I've been saying this for years, is I need to make a t-shirt that says like Lara ruins everything.
Oh my gosh.
Because I feel like I can, like, it's a superpower that I have. I don't want to, I don't seek out trying to ruin someone's day. But I do know a lot about exposures and, what materials contain what chemicals. And I don't have a ton of anxiety because I've learned to both temper and triage. And so what I mean by that is, and it can take a minute for people to get to that place where you're like, yeah, I went out for lunch and they put my leftovers in a styrofoam takeout container, and that really bums me out. But I'm not going to freak out, and maybe I'll eat some of the food, but I won't eat all of it. And now I'm just not going to go back to that restaurant, or I'm going to bring my own container and say, hey, can you put the leftovers in this? Right? So I'm just going to kind of navigate it with as much grace as I could possibly muster. And really this comes from, one, learning to triage, and two, the expression that I use is that we change the things we can control so we worry less about the ones that we can't. We buy ourselves some allowance, right? And so if I say, look, in my house, I'm buying mostly organic food. I don't put food in plastic containers. I don't, put leftovers in plastic. I don't really eat canned foods. They also have BPA. I say no to thermal receipts. All of my personal care products and household cleaners are made with safer ingredients. I don't have flame retardants in my couch. Like, I've gone out of my way to do a lot of these things, but it just means that I've bought myself some allowance.
Little cushions.
Right?
Yep.
So, I think that we do the best that we can in terms of reducing our exposures in as many places as we can. And it's going to take time for that to happen. It doesn't happen overnight. And also I'll point this out. This is more for folks that are either just getting started and are like, oh, where do I start? Or folks that are on a budget. I think, unfortunately, in the health space and in the wellness community online, there is this projection that this like super healthy lifestyle is really only for people that are affluent, and like if you can't afford this like $4,000 sauna, like you're gonna die. And I hate that, because in reality, unfortunately, the populations both here in the United States and globally that are most disproportionately exposed to toxic chemicals are low-income Black and Brown communities. We have redlining practices where we have devaluation of neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, and that is where waste factories and industries situate, where there's not as much green spaces, where they don't have access to healthy food. So like there are all of these sort of confounding factors that lead to this disproportionate exposure in different populations. And those individuals have less access to alternatives. So I think we really need to, for me as an educator and for the practitioners in your audience, like we really need to have a broader understanding of who is being exposed, who has access to what, and what can we do that's not a shop our way out of this solution, right? And so my recommendation is for individuals who are starting on this journey is to start with the things that are free and easy. That's the way I phrase it. What's free and what's easy? So free is opening your windows, literally open your windows. I know that just sounds so silly and pointless, but the reality is that the air inside our homes, because we generally don't open our windows, because of all these toxic chemicals in our paint and our carpeting and our couch and our furniture are off-gassing, they get trapped in our homes and they settle in our house dust. And then our kids are crawling around on the floor and they're sticking their hands in their mouth and they're getting higher exposures. And so if we open our windows, we can actually let some of those volatile chemicals dissipate into the air and we get fresh air inside our home. So free and easy, step number one is open your windows. Step number two is, this one sucks, I'm really sorry, increase house dusting and vacuuming, because those chemicals that off-gas also settle in our house dust, right? So for example, phthalates. Phthalates are
Ooh,
an
I'm
endocrine.
glad you're going there because
Yes.
you're just talking so well that I didn't want to interrupt
I've
you.
done that. I could talk about this for like 10 hours straight.
But I wanted, I mean, I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to go back to endocrine disrupting chemicals,
Yes.
one that you just mentioned. So yes, go there, please
Yes.
go there. Yeah.
So phthalates are an endocrine disrupting chemical. It is also not a chemical, it's a class of chemicals. So there's many types of phthalates. They're used primarily in two sort of categories. They're used in plastics to make plastics soft and flexible. So they're not going to be found in hard, rigid plastic. They're not in every plastic. They're just in, like, think about your shower curtain, your garden hose, those like rubbery Halloween masks that kids wear. I just bought RCA cables to hook up my turntable. And
Turntable.
yeah, I'm like, it came with a Prop 65 warning that it contains phthalates, and I was like, oh, geez, because they're just used for the flexibility in the cord. They're also used as a solvent and a fixative for fragrance. So if you are using a product that has fragrance as an ingredient, there is a very good chance that that fragrance mixture contains phthalates. So if we think, for example, of laundry products like dryer sheets or fabric softener, and some of these products, I don't know, Downy or Gain, I don't know, whatever. One of them advertises these like, long-term scent release beads, and you can take your towels out of the linen closet 6 months after you've washed them and they still smell like your detergent. And people love that, right? They love detergent smell. The problem is the thing that stretches the duration of the extent that that chemical lives or sticks around are phthalates, right? And so phthalates are in, whether it's a scented candle, if it's in your perfume, it's in your shampoo, all kind, even, mascara can sometimes have fragrance added. Why, I don't know, right? But sometimes fragrances are added to mask an unpleasant chemical smell. And so the front of the package might say fragrance free, but that doesn't mean that the ingredient doesn't have fragrance in it. You actually have to read the ingredients, right?
Wow.
And so this chemical is endocrine disrupting. One of the highest, one of the most studied endocrine disrupting chemicals aside from BPA are phthalates. There was actually a fascinating study that just came out. I just posted about it recently on my Instagram that was looking at phthalates in personal care products and parabens in personal care products. Parabens are also endocrine disrupting. There are preservative that's found in a lot of personal care products. And this was a study looking at breast cancer and the association between these chemicals and breast cancer. It's a really interesting study. They took a group of, I don't remember the count, it wasn't like hundreds of thousands, it was like 100 something, women, healthy women with no history of breast cancer. And they did a fine needle aspirate sample of breast tissue before and after this intervention. And the intervention was, let's take away and swap out all of your normal personal care products that all have phthalates and parabens in them, because that's just what's on the market, with products that are phthalate free and paraben free. And after 28 days, that's it, 28 days, they did another fine needle aspirate breast tissue sample. And what they found, and they did other samples, they did urine samples before and after as well. And so one, they found that urinary levels of both chemicals dropped significantly. Of course they would, because both of those chemicals are non-persistent. Their half-life in the body, or their excretion time, is like 6 to 12 hours. You take it in, you metabolize it, you pee it out. Now, that doesn't mean that in the short amount of time that it's in the body, it's not causing a problem. There's certainly research that shows that. But our levels are constant because we're taking them in faster than we can pee them out, right? So that's why this study was like, let's just take these personal care products out. And what they found was so interesting. They basically found that I'm just trying to see, I thought I had this slide up. I don't have it. Oh yes, I do. So they found that the after 28 days, it reversed pro-carcinogenic gene expression. So these women were healthy. They did not have breast cancer, but they already had pro-breast cancer genes expressing. And they pulled back and said, let's take these chemicals out. And then that gene expression dropped.
It's amazing, right? Which is encouraging. Yeah, there's some good news.
Totally encouraging.
Yep.
Yes. And so there, the study abstract says, estrogen-mediated functional signaling normalized within the period post 28 days of reduction. It normalized within breast cells, right? And so amazing. Pretty wild study. We don't really see studies that are designed in this way, but it was brilliant in the findings. I mean, this has a published date of May 2023, so it's like just come out.
Yeah.
And really, really interesting, right?
Is glyphosate also non-persistent? Because I've heard that if you change your diet, or maybe this was in regards to herbicides and pesticides, like changing your diet, there was a study, something like this, where in 28 days, checking levels pre and post, right? Your levels.
Yes, and it doesn't even take 28 days. So I don't know specifically for glyphosate in particular, but glyphosate is non-persistent. So, in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, we actually moved away from the organochlorine pesticides, which are highly, highly persistent. Those were the ones that Rachel Carson wrote about in her 1962 book, Silent Spring. Yep. And so what was on the market then were organochlorine pesticides like DDT. And so highly, highly persistent and toxic. And so that was why we were like, yep, this whole class has to go. Not this chemical and that chemical, which is what we fight about now, but they were like, this class of chemicals is toxic and persistent, and we need to get rid of it. So we switched to organophosphate pesticides from organochlorine. Organophosphate pesticides are not persistent. They are still toxic, but they're not persistent. And so there have been multiple studies in people and adults and children that have found that when they switched from a conventional diet to a mostly organic diet, not even 100%, they're able to drop circulating pesticide levels in urinary metabolites by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days.
Wow.
Because they're not persistent. And so when it comes, I literally just did this post, I think, on social media just the other day.
Everybody follow her on social media. It sounds like you have some good posts.
Is that the best intervention when it comes to toxic exposures within the realm of non-persistent chemicals, which is a lot of them, certainly not all of them, is avoidance. That's it. We don't need a supplement. We don't need a detox protocol. It's avoidance. That is the most powerful intervention. And that, I think, is where, it's actually why I love working with practitioners, because, they are often taught, depending on obviously what their area of training is or specialty is, but they're often, they often jump to the protocol. Let me give you this supplement regime or this complicated detox process regime. Let's test you for all these chemicals. Oh, wow, you have them. No shit, sorry. But everyone has them, right? And so a lot of times those tests aren't really, not that they're not helpful, but they're telling us things that we already know.
You would say that to defend myself, because I'm one of those practitioners. I have to say some patients have to see it on paper. Like they
yes,
legitimately have to see it on paper where I can say, look how high these levels are. And to, to prove to them, you have had an exposure to this gasoline additive or whatever it is. Like,
yes,
and then they're like, oh
yes,
yeah, there was this big leak. Or, I mean, some patients just need to
to
see
see
it
it.
on paper to make the change. Some
Totally,
people.
totally. So yeah, it's a yes and, right? Like everything, it's a yes and. And so anyway, the most powerful intervention for a lot of these exposures is just minimizing exposure in as many places as possible, right? And so, and that's lifestyle, lifestyle behavior change. It takes time to implement, but in a lot of instances, the effect can be immediate, right? With these non-persistent chemicals. So, there was a study, similar study to the, not a breast cancer study, but to the personal care product swap that was using, I think it's called a Hermosa study, and it was with Latina teenage girls who use like a ton of, all teenage girls tend to use a ton of, makeup and eyeshadow and perfume and all the stuff. And they did a similar study where they said, let's swap out these paraben, phthalate, triclosan containing personal care products with ones that don't have these. And they saw an enormous drop, 30, 47, I think 47% in a week. And so there's a lot of research to support that when we practice these behavior changes, these avoidance behaviors, we can actually reduce the levels in our bodies, which is what we're aiming for.
Yes, that makes me feel better when I like get my makeup done. We recently had headshots taken, right? You get your makeup done, all that. And I'm like just thinking, I'm cringing every time I get all that stuff sprayed on my face. I get acne when I normally don't get acne, but I'm like, okay, this is one day of exposure, like twice a year or whatever. Like I can handle it. I can handle that one. Yeah, when I normally use very safe products.
Yeah, same thing happened to me a couple months ago. I got my hair cut, and the hairstylist, I was just like, look, I'm not gonna be a little annoying person and be like, can you use no product on me? Just like, let her do her thing. It's fine. Yes, did I get into my car under like a cloud of, hair product smell, and did I promptly go home and wash it out? Yes. But you should
be able to handle that. We shouldn't have to live in a bubble. Like we should be able
and
to
there are some people can't handle it, right? Whether they're chemically sensitive. And so some people, like, they can't do that. They have to just say, look, I need you to cut my hair and don't use any product. And it can be really hard to be that person in the world.
I have a lot of those as my patients.
So
let me go back to endocrine disrupting chemicals, because you did mention for a moment. So we talked about phthalates, and then you mentioned kind of parabens, and you said triclosan. Can you just expand on what those are briefly, what those two are? And I want to talk about PCBs also.
So parabens are a preservative. They're found in a wide range of personal care products. The more liquid the product is, the more parabens are going to be present, because the liquid is water.
And sometimes in corn shells at the grocery store, I found.
Oh, really?
Have you ever seen that? I did a social media post on this, and I'm like, why would there be parabens in my corn tortilla?
So there are a couple of parabens that are approved for food use, which is not great. And I think there was just yesterday, I want to say, I don't remember what state it was. I want to say like someplace in New England, like New Hampshire or something like that. Just put forth a proposal for a law that's actually going to ban certain ingredients from food, and one of those I think was a methylparaben. So
that's what it was, I think.
So so parabens are a preservative. Like, here's the thing, we don't want no preservatives, right? We need preservation in our products, because without preservation in our products, we run the risk of bacteria growth, and that can be problematic, right? We don't want to be applying something to our skin if it's riddled with bacteria or mold or something like that. And so preservation is important. The problem is that parabens are, while they're a great preservative, they're also an endocrine disruptor. And so we don't want to be putting those products that contain parabens on our skin. There's better preservatives out there that we can use. So let's just use them. Parabens are cheap, so that's why they're commonly used. But yes, they are another endocrine disrupting chemical. Triclosan is a antibacterial ingredient. It's not as commonly used as it used to be in personal care products. It is like I said, it's antibacterial. And it used to be used very heavily in hand soaps and hand sanitizers. That was actually banned in 2016 or 17. The FDA was like, yeah, you can't put that chemical in, not necessarily because of its toxicity, although there is plenty of research showing that it is an endocrine disrupting chemical. Why? Because of the triclosan, right? That's chlorine.
Chloride? Oh, chlorine. Okay.
Right. So that's the chlorine, and that chlorine, bromine, and fluorine.
Same thing. Yep.
Yeah. So directly affects thyroid health. So it was actually banned not because of its toxicity, but because the companies couldn't prove that its inclusion in hand sanitizers and hand soaps was actually more effective than just soap and water. So it was a completely unnecessary ingredient. And the FDA was like, you can't use this chemical, technically registered as a pesticide. You can't use this if it's not actually doing anything. So it was banned from hand soaps and hand sanitizers at a commercial level, but if you work in a clinical setting, you can still find triclosan in hand sanitizers and hand soaps in hospital settings, in clinic settings. It was only banned from those two categories at the consumer level. Some toothpastes can contain it, some deodorants can contain it. And if you've ever gone shopping for a cutting board or socks or running shoes, and you see this protected by microban technology, that is essentially a form of triclosan that has now been embedded into the cutting board or the handle of your pizza cutter or your gym socks as a mechanism of, like, tackling bacteria. The problem is, and this is just a intentionally deceptive marketing, is people are like, oh, I'm going to be safe from bacteria on this product. No, those compounds, antibacterials, are there to protect the integrity of the material, not the person who's interacting with it. But they don't tell you that. So
scary. Speaking of toothpaste, earlier you mentioned many toothpaste have sodium lauryl sulfate. What's the challenge with, I'm just asking questions I think our listeners would want to also know. What's the problem with sodium lauryl sulfate?
So sodium lauryl sulfate is not a toxic chemical. It's not an endocrine disruptor. It's not going to carcinogen. The primary problem with sodium lauryl sulfate is, one, it can be irritating because it's a surfactant, which just means a surface acting agent, and it's the thing that helps. It's what creates suds, and it helps kind of pull fats away and wash them down the drain. That's why, like, your shampoo has it, because it foams, it gets all that soap, the fat, the oils, and washes them out. There are other products that are surfactants that are not quite as irritating. And so, one, it can be really drying and irritating to the skin. It can also be essentially what's referred to as a penetration enhancer, which means because it's stripping fats and oils from your skin, it can kind of weaken the integrity of your skin and cause other ingredients in the product that may be problematic to kind of move through the layers of your skin and potentially get into your bloodstream. It's mostly, I think, it's often on the sort of no list from a lot of, low tox companies that are using, safer ingredients in their personal care products. It doesn't sit as high on the shelf of concern as something like phthalate does, but for some people it can be really irritating. The bigger concern is the chemical that's used to replace sodium lauryl sulfate, because it can be irritating to the skin, is sodium laureth sulfate, and it's LAURETH. And so the ETH, and any chemical that has that ETH, so satireth, there's a lot of chemicals that have this. That is an indication that the chemical has undergone a process called ethoxylation. And during that chemical process, there is a very strong potential for a byproduct to be formed. It's not an ingredient, it's just a byproduct from the chemical process called 1,4-dioxane, and that is a carcinogen. It's typically, if it's present in extremely tiny amounts, but it is a known carcinogen. And it's just, like I said, on the triage list I would much rather prioritize somebody taking out a paraben or a phthalate, which we absolutely know is going to be concerning, versus an ingredient that may possibly have a byproduct that is, it may not have the byproduct. Some companies can strip it out. Some companies, it's just,
Sure. Back to that
it's
triage.
prioritizing.
Yep. Okay, last chemical question, because I know we've gone a long time here. What about PCBs? Where do we find PCBs?
PCBs are primarily going to be found in food at this point. So polychlorinated biphenyls, these are chemicals that were primarily banned in the 1970s because of their toxicity and persistence. They are endocrine disrupting, they are carcinogens, they are highly, highly persistent. And different congeners of PCBs can behave differently in the body, but generally speaking, they are toxic chemicals that we do want to avoid because of their persistence. They tend to accumulate in animals, right? In adipose tissue. And so animal products are our primary source of PCB, including things like seafood and farmed seafood in particular, and then high fat dairy products. You can go and look for pastured and organic meats and dairy. This does not mean that it's not going to have any toxic chemicals whatsoever, because these chemicals are just distributed in the environment. And so if your animal is outside, or any animal is outside and it's grazing or eating other animals or whatever, as in the case of fish, then it can accumulate there. So our primary exposure source to PCBs is seafood, meat, and dairy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for really diving into all those endocrine disrupting chemicals. We spent the
And
brunt
there's
of this.
many more.
Oh, yeah. Those are just the ones that I wanted to ask you about today. And thank you also for just giving us tips on kind of triaging and how we can reduce anxiety over this whole topic, because it can be very overwhelming. And I have some patients who like get post-traumatic stress disorder over.
Yeah,
They think they're avoiding something and then they find out they're getting it somewhere else and whatnot. So this has been wonderful. And I want to learn more. So I do want to ask you just a few more questions, especially about resources and courses you have available. But before we get to that, I do want to ask how you do live in this world. So let me ask you, what are your non-negotiables? Like in your household, what is something that is not allowed? What are you 100% or maybe not 100%?
Fragrance.
Fragrance,
like
okay.
scented I don't have scented candles or air fresheners. I hate it when people, no one in my immediate circle is like a perfume wearer, but like that I hate. Like I had a pet sitter come for an interview about pet sitting, and she had so much perfume on, and she like sat on my couch, and it took
You're like
3 days.
no, yeah.
Well, it took like 3 days to dissipate. I was like, dang. So that's one of my non-negotiables.
Yep. Anything else in your house? Obviously, you do filter your water. Like, how do you live in this world? What are your you've already given us some steps of, obviously avoidance is important, but like, what are maybe 3 to 5 things that you think are the biggest needle movers? They're just ways you've learned to live your life. If we kind of had to summarize this up, kind of 3 to 5 things that you would recommend.
I think, one, avoiding fragrance across the board, right?
Okay. Yep.
In as many places as possible. Household cleaners, personal care products, laundry products, scented home fragrances, just take those out. Take them out. They're not necessary, right? Especially when it comes to like home fragrances, like scented candles and sprays and diffusers, and essential oils, I think, fall into that category. A lot of people love essential oils. I don't, frankly. They are volatile organic compounds. They can be irritants. They can be respiratory irritants, allergenic triggers for people. And I think in the wellness space, there's this oversaturation of like diffuse oils and to do this. And it's like, these are highly, highly concentrated chemicals that we never would interact with in our normal everyday lives. If you want your house to smell like roses, go get some roses. Don't diffuse rose essential oil, whatever, right? Like it's an example, but like they're highly, highly concentrated. They're toxic to animals in a lot of cases. So, they're not, I think the misconception is if something is natural, it's safe. If something is synthetic, it's toxic. That is not that simple. Arsenic is natural. Mercury is natural. Lead is natural. Opium, natural, all things that are highly toxic. So we have to dispel that belief. So one, I'd get rid of fragrances across the board. If you have the resources to prioritize organic foods whenever possible. It's not possible all the time. Filtering your water, switching to personal care products, not even just fragrance, but that are, phthalate free and paraben free. And so those are sort of the big ones that are more accessible to people. So that's how I jam. That's my jam. That's how I do it. Everything is glass and metal and for food and no plastics. I limit canned foods. Very rarely have canned foods because canned foods contain BPA. I say no to cash register receipts. That's how I do it.
Good tips. Okay. Top resources that our audience could, I'm sure after listening to you, they want to hear more. So where can they find more, just good resources in general on kind of avoiding toxins, but also tell us about your website where listeners can find you, what courses you have available there as well.
Yeah, so for people for anybody can come to my Instagram, which you can find me there at Environmental Toxins Nerd. I'm not on TikTok yet, but I have that same handle, so people can follow me there and I'll start posting content there soon. And then my website, which is just laraadler.com, which is my name. There's, like I said, in the social media platform, it's education and information that is accessible for everybody. It still is designed for a health practitioner, health professional, or somebody with a health-based business. One of the things that I teach, it's not just information and stats and this chemical is linked to that. We do really have to learn how to talk about these exposures in ways that doesn't overwhelm people, want people to bury their heads in the sand. And that is very much a developed skill. And so I work a lot with my students on how do we have these conversations in our businesses in ways that empowers people and doesn't overwhelm them. That's not sensational or fear-mongering, because look, it's 2023. The world is already a wild and scary place. We do not need more. It might be clickbait and get sort of social currency, but it doesn't actually earn actual currency for people that are doing this professionally. So if somebody is a health professional or has a health-based business, I really encourage you guys to come check out the courses that I teach. This is the core of what I do, is educate, and you can find all those courses that are listed up on my website under the courses section. I think that's it. Other resources. So a really great app and browser extension that I love is called Clearya, Clearya. As a app and as a browser extension, it basically scans ingredient lists on a handful of websites. So Amazon, Target, Walmart, Sephora, and iHerb, I think, are the 5 websites that they currently partner with. And so if the listing has ingredients, they will scan the ingredients, and they don't give a rating system. I don't like apps that use rating systems. They just highlight, this one is, green is fine, yellow is orange is not great, red has some toxicity issues. And then you can just decide from there, do I want to buy this product or not? So I just feel like that's one of the best resources. They've also actually, it's not out yet. I have early access. It's not out yet, but they're updating their app so you can actually scan barcodes on products. So you don't actually have to go to Amazon or Sephora's website or Target's website.
I haven't heard of that. Clear, Clearya, Clearya?
Yeah, Clearya.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I think it's the only app that I really recommend, because it's not it doesn't use a rating system, and rating systems can inherently be problematic because if the methodology to develop that rating isn't great, then the score is less meaningful.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, last question. Finally, your top longevity tip. You can totally repeat something you already said, but
yeah, I'm just going to say minimize exposure to environmental chemicals, period, end of story. Do your best.
Makes sense. And you can help us do that. This was awesome. Thank you. I know this was a long interview, but thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're so welcome.
And just sharing the danger of environmental toxins and how, small amounts can really add up, and sharing kind of what we can do to avoid that. That is probably on our side the most, the avoidance piece. So this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Take care.